It's so good to see you today at our first seminar.
І я також буду записувати.
And I will be also recording today's session. That is why, if you don't want your face to be visible in the recording, then please stop your video.
Я починаю запис.
And the recording is on.
Вітаю, шановні колеги. Мене звуть Світлана.
Once again, welcome colleagues. My name is Svetlana Melnik, and I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Slavic and East European Studies, Indiana University. And today I have an honor to moderate our first seminar, our first seminar meeting, or our first seminar. And I have the honor to kick off the series of the seminars. Our colleagues will present very relevant, interesting speeches that will result in a very lively discussion, because we'll be talking about education. First is Mykhailo Honchar. Mr. Honchar works at the Pedagogics and Education Management at the Kherson Continuing Education Academy. He's interested in history of education, educational institutions, etc. And today's presentation has to do with educators' collaborationism. Mykhailo, over to you.
Дякую, пані Світлана.
Thank you so much, Ms. Melnik. Okay, let me first share my presentation.
Так.
Чудово.
Here it comes. Amazing.
Плашечка мішає. Так, видно, да? Все добре?
Видно.
Okay, you are supposed to be able to see my presentation now. Good afternoon, colleagues. It is a pleasure to meet you all at this seminar. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Indiana University for such an important scholarship for Ukrainian scholars. You are not only supporting us during difficult times, but you are also helping us to strengthen communication ties with American scholars. And I hope that there will come a day when we'll be able to meet not online, but rather face-to-face, and in a peaceful atmosphere, share all of our professional achievements. Today is the day 559 of the full-scale Russia's invasion in Ukraine. We shall understand that a war started earlier than 2022. It started back in 2014, but historically it started even earlier than that. Nevertheless, using this opportunity as a citizen, I would like to express the gratitude to the American people for the tremendous support you are providing to our country, our people, while we're fighting the Russian aggressor. As I'm studying education collaborationism during the Russia-Ukraine war, I would like to focus on this subject matter specifically and share some of the outcomes of my research with you. And before we dive deeper into this topic, I would like to mention some of the language peculiarities, because collaborationism as a term, collaborator, collaborate, collaboration, collaborationist, all of these terms, they stem from Latin. Therefore, in leading global languages, there are, so to say, certain things that highlight that collaboration as a phenomenon can be both positive, say collaboration between a teacher and a student, as well as a negative connotation. For example, collaboration with an enemy. And I will be elaborating on the latter, about the negative context of collaboration. Collaboration of the people with the invaders, and it existed throughout the human history. People were selling food, produce, and would accept money to go and join the enemy's army. This was a normal phenomenon, and nobody used to call it collaborationism before that, even though there was some resistance to the invaders before that. A more conscious understanding that any collaboration with the enemy treason happened when the nation was shaped in the second half of the 18th and 19th centuries, and it especially gained a negative connotation. I'm talking about the term collaborationism in 1940s and after the World War II. And it has to do with the name of Marshal Pétain, who, to save the national pride of France, agreed to collaborationism with the Hitler's Germany. That is why collaborationism is viewed by us as moral and political participation. For example, describing those who helped or assisted in joining the vile regime, betrayed their people, or participated in committing crimes and in committing genocide. Presently, the majority of different aspects of collaboration related to the World War II, which is not a surprise because Russia's invasion in Ukraine is the biggest war in the continental Europe since the times of the World War II. Many things that happened during World War II can be also seen today. Russian occupation administration is trying to engage Ukrainians in cultural, administrative, economic, and a military collaboration. If we compare it with the World War II, I would like to mention that German occupational authorities in the Soviet Union, and especially in Western Europe, barely paid attention to education. They were not even interested in it. The Germans mostly paid attention to local initiatives regarding opening schools by the local groups of people. But still, this mainly had to do with the elementary school, sometimes secondary schools too. At the same time, Germans were interested in vocational education and higher education. And this was related to preparing people who could be used for Wehrmacht, for example, working for the German army. Currently, the situation is different. The Russian occupying authorities do care, and they pay special attention to collaboration with educators, and namely school teachers. The interest to this category is so big that teachers are forced to collaborate. I am convinced that the vivid interest of the occupying authorities to engage as many Ukrainian teachers as possible is covered by the following factors. First, the resumption of work at schools, kindergartens, and universities in the occupied territory, as it is a sign of stability and well-being. Such messages can be conveyed using propaganda, TV, and the internet, both for domestic and foreign audience. Second, teachers are the only professional group involved in the education and upbringing of children, and accordingly, ideas of loyalty to the regime and the futility of resistance can be conveyed with their help. Third, teachers, especially in rural areas, are authorities of public opinion and therefore are good at retelling occupation narratives for building loyalty in local people and minimizing resistance. 4. By communicating with children, teachers can obtain information about the situation in the family, and such information is important for the special services. 5. Teachers who voluntarily agree to collaborate with the occupation authorities are more motivated and responsible in performing the tasks assigned to them. 6. teachers are a professional tool for forming
До російської держави.
attitudes of love to the Russian state, as well as imposing Russian identity and stripping children of the Ukrainian identity. The factor that influenced the willingness of Ukrainian teachers to agree to voluntary collaboration with the Russian occupiers in the present war are the following, according to me. The first one is ideological factor, i.e., persistent perception of Russia as a powerful state and Russians as a brotherly people, resentment and or hatred of Ukraine and Ukrainians, which until a certain time had a very latent character. To this group also includes people, mostly elderly, retired, who have nostalgia for their youth in the Soviet Union, and thus build a logical connection between the occupation and the return to a stable past of the great state. Second, a national factor. Teachers who, by the nationality or birth, identified themselves with Russia and the Russian people. But during peaceful days, they didn't really manifest it. During the occupation, they saw no difference in which country to work. And namely, let's take Kherson Oblast as an example. We see some localities that historically are connected to the Russian gubernias because people were relocated, where teachers are saying, well, we are Russians, so what's wrong with us working for the Russian state? So it also has to do with the nationality. The next factor is career, the opportunity to realize their ambitions in new conditions for those who, under the Ukrainian authorities, had no opportunity for career advancement because of their professional and human traits. For example, becoming the deputy principal or head of a school or kindergarten. Usually these are lazy people, but ambitious, or people who have very poor leader qualities, but ambitious. They want to manage something, they want to rule something, but they don't understand how much responsibility will they assume with this. And it's been 18 months since the beginning of their full-scale invasion, and we'll see that those people who, on this wave of occupation, managed to take up leadership positions, the Russian occupational regime is now trying to get rid of them because these people are inefficient to implement the tasks that are assigned by the occupation authorities. The next factor is adaptation or mimicry, the desire not to lose work in the new geopolitical reality. This is what the Russian propaganda is using of the occupation. And these people do not have any ideological motivation. They are solely guided by the survival instinct. This cohort also includes a few idealists who believe that no upheavals can affect their professional calling. At the same time, they don't consider themselves collaborators by arguing in the following way: I'm a teacher, I'm teaching children, and I don't have anything to do with politics. The next factor is satisfaction. And I called it satisfaction, but maybe colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong. These are individuals who previously had trouble with law or were dismissed from school for disruptive behavior due to collaboration, and they managed to get back to their previous position. Well, not rehabilitate themselves, but to prove that everything is not that bad. Yes, I did some bad things, but in the new reality, I'm a good person. I'm the good person under this occupational regime. And the last factor that I have mentioned is material benefit, and this is a very popular one. These are teachers in kindergartens who were bribed by the high salaries. Sadly, our economy does not allow to pay higher salaries. That is why, for example, the salaries increased by the Russians to about 570 USD, which now is 400 USD. For these people is an important reason that they are ready to collaborate with the new Russian authorities. And it is worth mentioning that such a high salary in Kherson Oblast and in Zaporizhia Oblast is even higher than in some poor Russian regions itself. So we understand that this is a simple bribery to lure such weak teachers using money as a bait. And today we already possess some information that these salaries are now changing. So basically, they can earn 200 USD, the same which the teachers, the beginning teachers used to earn. So they basically were deceived. In this context, it is very interesting to also mention how many school teachers agreed to become collaborators. Presently, we do not have the exact number because of the presumption of innocence when only a court can prove a person as a criminal, and collaborationism became the legal norm only in March 2022. So in 2014, Crimea was occupied, then Donetsk and Luhansk were occupied, and only in 2022 our legislators finally decided that collaborationism actually is a crime. So this is the current situation. So it is pretty difficult to identify who is the collaborationism in terms of betraying the interests of their people. And here's another challenge too. There is limited information because there is less and less reliable information incoming from the occupied territories, which in its turn does not allow us to make conclusions whether the person decided to collaborate or refused to collaborate. So therefore, there are lots of pitfalls. Now, analyzing the situation in Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, which were almost entirely occupied in February and March 2022, we can say for sure that Russian occupation administration came across a problem of lack of loyalty among the educators. According to my calculations, in Kherson Oblast, in September 2022, the occupation authorities managed to include no more than 10% of the pre-war number of teachers. I'm not talking about professorship. I'm not talking about associate professors. I'm only talking about school teachers exclusively. No more than 10%. And this was a problem for the occupation authorities when it came to opening kindergarten and schools in different parts of Kherson Oblast. On this slide, you can see the comparison of pre-war education network in Kherson Oblast and what is declared, and by the way, we cannot be sure that it is true, what is declared by the Occupational Ministry of Education in Kherson Oblast. And here's a map. Here you can see these blue-red dots. These are schools that, according to them, at least according to what they're declaring, that have gotten back on track with their education and teaching. But again, this data is also not quite reliable because the school was open as of September 1. and the vacation has been announced right after that, or renovation, or there is illegal education happening in the occupied territories, and as a rule, it is happening in the school facilities. So September 1 was the first day of school, and then they announced that until the 11th or 15th of September, your kids are going to be on the vacation. So the information is not quite reliable, and you have to constantly double check it, look for alternative sources.
Якщо вас зацікавить більше інформації,
Respectively, if you're interested in obtaining more information about the situation with the education in the occupied part of Kherson region, I published an article, and if you are interested, you can scan this QR code and read this article. I would like to reiterate the following. I would like to draw attention to the way the Russian occupiers are using the educators in the occupied territories in terms of indoctrination. And I have noticed that there are the cases of the use of teachers for the interests of the Russian occupiers in the occupied territories. First and foremost, it's about teaching in the Russian language under Russian textbooks and gradual or complete displacement of Ukrainian language and literature from educational programs. Officially, it is declared that the Russian language and the Ukrainian language and also Crimean Tatar are the official languages in these territories, including Crimea, but in reality, only Russian is used. The history is taught under Russian textbooks, and they have no mention of Ukraine, and that the same applies to geography. I know that you must have heard about the textbook for the 11th grade that was prepared by the ex-Minister of Culture Mudinsky, who has completely distorted the post-war history. His interpretation caused a lot of outcry among academia. Harassment or bullying of students for using Ukrainian symbols and identity, and spreading Ukrainian content like music, songs, poems, etc. From time to time, we see the reports about the students or some citizens of the occupied territories being detained by police only for Ukrainian symbols or identity symbols. There is the hostile attitude towards Ukraine and everything Ukrainian being shaped. School children are encouraged to obtain Russian passports. Apart from that, there are activities that are military oriented held at schools, like cadet classes. Removing from textbooks fiction and visual aids of Ukrainian symbols and saturating them instead with Russian materials. Conducting educational activities at school, like a letter to a soldier, writing letters to Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. It means that our children in occupied territories are forced to write letters to the Russian occupiers who have occupied this territory. Could you imagine this psychological pressure and the extent of this psychological pressure? They are forced to do that, and their parents are also forced to take part in this effort. Another type of activities in school is called a conversation about important matters. This is the class where students are told about certain pro-Russian narratives, events that are related to the Great Patriotic War. We do know that Russians trying to validate the events of the Great Patriotic War and want to pay special attention to the special role of the Russians, not the Soviet people, not the other nations, but the Russians only. And uh, if it hadn't been for the Russians, the Nazi Germany would not have uh, been defeated. They are depicted as the victors of the Second World War. In Ukraine, on the contrary, we do not pay this special attention to the role of Ukrainians as the victors of the World War II because it was carried out alongside the other nations. Integration of Ukrainian children and youth into social and cultural space of the Russian Federation through participation in Russian events. We see many reports about the fact that children are brought to to numerous events in the Russian territory with some ideological brainwashing and the stories of Russian greatness being told. I have a couple of photos from different sources to make it visual so that you could see how Russians work with our children on occupied territories in order to instill these Russian narratives in them. Another thing to mention is the participation of children in the activities of Russian pro-military youth organizations like Young Army, Young Guard of Единая Россия, Russian movement of children and youth, the Volunteers of Victory, and Youth Army, the militarized organization for youth. Children are forced to wear military uniforms in this organization. They are marching, they are singing military songs, they are taught how to use arms, and all these efforts are the elements of militarization of the mindset of children, so that at certain point in time they would be ready to defend this new motherland, Russia. Speaking about the photos on the slide, it says, "I'm Russian of Ukrainian origin." What is that? Children are explained that Ukrainians do not exist, that Ukrainians were some Russians who have decided to separate themselves and they invented some sort of culture that is substandard and of poor quality. You see these young and girls marching wearing military uniform. These are the 10th, 11th grade students. Parents are forced to buy these military uniforms for their children as the Russian army cannot provide for this establishment. But parents are forced to pay for this effort. While looking at this photo, I would like to tell you that since 2014, and there were a lot of things happening in this part. For instance, this is Stepanov Maxim, who was born in 2001, and he was born in a village not far from Simferopol in Crimea. This village is called Zuya. When he turned 18, he joined the ranks of the Russian army and he died in Ukrainian territory. Therefore, a Ukrainian child who was brought up in Ukraine, then lived in the occupied territory, was called up to the Russian army and died in Ukrainian territory. So for 9 years in a row, we see the same things happening in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Children who were born in Ukraine are dying for inexplicable ideas for some made up motherland. And I would like to underscore the fact that this is the policy of the Russian authorities to militarize youth and to throw them for the effort of conquering new territories. And we have seen many examples of that in history. Summing it all up, I draw the following conclusion. Russian-Ukrainian war created new form of a collaborationism, educational collaborationism. Yes, we may discuss the terminology, but this is the way I see it. Educational collaborationism is a voluntary, and I would like to underscore the part voluntary collaboration with the occupation administration of the specialists who are professionally related to the organization and functioning of education and the upbringing system within the institutional activities of educational institutions of various types, meaning schools, vocational and educational training facilities, and universities and institutes. And this is just a draft, but I wanted to set out some criteria of educational collaborationism belonging to a professional corporation of teachers with appropriate professional training, belonging to a profession at the time of occupation of the territory. That could be debated. That is debatable, as sometimes people who have been outside the education system are engaged in this kind of activity. But still, there is the high share of those who have been working in the education system at the time of occupation. And the third criteria I would like to offer is the consent for voluntary collaboration and the implementation of Russian education standards. But all this requires comprehensive approach because those who take part in young army efforts, they are brought up in schools, but then the military bases and military units are engaged. And now I would like also to share my observations that still require certain reflections and deliberations. I have a couple of ideas, and I would like to share them with you. There are some collaborators who, before the war, had a very clear pro-Ukrainian position, and they are the educators. So I do not understand how come that they have changed their standpoint completely. We are not talking about some neutral educators. We are talking about those who were completely pro-Ukrainian before the war, and now they are pro-Russian collaborators. I want to understand how this mindset shift took place. And another idea, and my colleagues often pay attention to this phenomenon as well. Collaborators who were teaching the history of Ukraine and Ukrainian language were more prone to collaboration rather than teachers of accurate sciences like physics, mathematics, or chemistry. It means that people who are working in the sphere of ideology like history and languages became collaborators more often. Thank you for your attention. I tried to be concise, although I had a lot to tell, and now I'm looking forward to your questions, ideas, statements, comments.
Пане Михайле, дуже дякуємо за таку глибоку і ґрунтовну доповідь.
Mykhailo, thank you very much for your substantial research. I really enjoyed your presentation just from the point of view of the way you
є
presented it, but on the contrary, I am very much bewildered and I am very much upset by the information you have offered due to the seriousness of the situation. Svetlana, in fact, I would like to reassure you that this share of collaborationism in 2023, 2022 is so low that actually I'm surprised by the behavior of our educators who have been pressured, but they left the territories. They were looking for any possible option to avoid this collaboration. Therefore, this 10% in Crimea, in Donetsk, and in Luhansk, of course, this figure is higher because there are some peculiarities of these regions. But still, in 30 years of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian educational system was able to create this national community of educators. Therefore, I'm very optimistic about this figure and presentation. Dear colleagues, as expected, we have many hands raised, so we will have here the debate. I do not know who was first to raise the hand, but I would like to give the floor to Sri Homenko in the order of appearance on my screen. Thank you, Mykhailo, for your wonderful presentation. You were telling us about the situation. I actually enjoyed your presenting style. And I had these similar feelings, the same feelings, because the same things are happening in my hometown, the south of Donetsk region, the city of Mariupol. I have two questions, but I would like to respond to the last observations you mentioned, which require more reflection and deliberation, the phenomena that seem to be a paradox to you. The the first that you mentioned that many activists, educators, volunteers who have been very active in their pro-Ukrainian position before the war, and now they became collaborators. It is the same in Mariupol. We actually had a scandal. Well, let's call it the outcry among the educators who have left that our leader, the educator who was the head of the change makers, and also she was the facilitator of New Ukrainian School, the teacher of Ukrainian language, who was probably sleeping at night while wearing Ukrainian embroidery short blouse, became a collaborator on a voluntary basis. Yes, voluntarily. I think that we could find the reason for that on the list of motives that you had on your slide. I think it's just the career factor. Probably you are right, but the more information I have, the more opportunities I will have to compare the data. Maybe they were latent pro-Russian lovers, but they were wearing Ukrainian embroidery costumes. I don't know. And another observation, your second observation, and it was triggering me a lot at the beginning. And I'm a historian and as my educational background. So they were the teachers of Ukrainian history who were changing their opinions so quickly. How come that teachers of history and teachers of the Ukrainian language, I do not know the reason for that. I do agree that it is very suspicious. We could only play the guessing game over here. In the occupied territories, a lot of attention is paid to humanitarian sciences, especially history.
історики в шоколаді, як вони самі
Тренді,
And
себе
да.
you
говорять.
know, historians are now very well off in the occupied territories. They enjoy a lot of benefits. They are sent to the conferences, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, and they got certain grants.
Що вони там в провінційному Маріуполі могли
And
заробити? І зараз от та
this is
така
about
трансформація,
the
це, звісно,
monetary
це, звісно,
interest, the
не
pecuniary
просто так,
interest, because
враховуючи
they
ту
were not
рекламу,
making
яку
that much
приділяють цій історії,
in Mariupol
сучасний,
before the war.
ідеологічний, і навіть
Therefore, Russian occupiers
і навіть
are
геополітики
paying a
них.
lot of attention to the historians as the part of their geopolitical
От знову ж таки
efforts.
корисний момент, який, ну скажімо так, спонукає цих людей перевзувати,
This is about financial interest, I think, that prompted these people to change their opinions. The teachers of the Ukrainian language, well, I do not have a response to that. And now I'm sorry for taking too much of your time. Just two questions. The first one, the motivation of the collaborators that you prepared, does it include the hierarchy of the motives, or is it just the random order, as you have mentioned ideology first, then nationality, then career? Is it a hierarchy or not? No, it was the random list, random order, and I would like to dive deeper into this motivation list as I collect more information and more unbiased information on the behavioral patterns of the educators, and then I will be able to set the priorities and to apply some statistical approach. As today it was more at random, as these are the factors that are mentioned by people. They write about them, and I have made a list of those. Of course, it is very difficult to carry out this kind of research because, as a rule, collaborationism is studied in post-war period. Therefore, there is no clear understanding in terms of this phenomenon, especially in the educational sphere. Probably we would retire and there will be still studies on this matter. Of course, it's hard to imagine this kind of motivation because people could say different things, but that would not match the reality. Well, it's not the motivation, it's the excuse. We have a different history of occupation, different story of occupation compared to Kherson. Our justification is that Ukraine has ditched us. We were sitting under the bombs flying over for 2 months. Ukrainians have left. Ukrainian army has left, and we were held hostages by these two parties, and they are both to be blamed. You cannot blame me personally. And some have mental issues. And when the person is not very stable mentally, of course, he or she could change the ideological views.
Писав, да, це важливий момент.
І друге питання теж
Thank you so much, you noted it. And one more question, a practical question. And I would say that I also covered that because I study historical policy in the occupied territories, but not only that. And I take a lot of information from non-official sources. And some say that they say there somebody else informs me about something that we did this. And how do we refer to that in papers? Well, this is a very good question. I have been thinking about that, and my colleague is also here who participates, and I have also discussed it with him, like, how do we do with this specifically so that you don't fabricate science but also try to convey. And I'm still thinking about how to do that, because official sources are one thing, but unofficial ones are another thing. Because people are not gonna give their name, and yeah, you also are worried not to harm these people, if you mention their last name. Well, well, so far the semi-official source for me is the the Telegram channels of the occupational authorities. Yes, it's very difficult to double check and fact check the gossip, especially if those come from the occupied territories. You have to look for some alternative, because I reread the studies of Americans about collaborationism, and I'm trying to find how to convey this information without causing any problems. Thank you once again. It's extremely interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. Yes, please. Go ahead, Tim. Over to you. Do I have to switch to English? No, you don't have to switch, because we have interpretation. I cannot hear Tim, though.
Yeah, you're on mute, Tim.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So this is wonderful to meet you over Zoom, and this is such important research, and your article as well, which I had a chance to read. So thank you for presenting and helping us to understand the nation and extent of teacher collaborationism. I would love to hear more about how you were able to even gather this information, given the very difficult situation on the ground as you described. So how were you able to collect this important information, and what information is and is not available, and how do you even get it?
Дякую за
Thank you so much
важливе питання.
for such an important question.
Хочу сказати, що
I would like to say that, I lived through all these events, because
очолюю управління освіти
am a head of the education management of Beroslav Amalgamated Community in Kherson Oblast, and we were under occupation too. And when I was in the government-controlled area of Ukraine, I went through all of that together with my colleagues, other educators. We went through all of these processes, occupation, and I also came across a situation when, we have known a person for years, and then suddenly this individual says, I was appointed as the head of the education department of the occupational administration, and you don't know what to do about it. Living through all of these events basically prompted me, and talking to my colleagues from different regions, from Donetsk, Luhansk oblasts, basically prompted me to even think about this problematics. That Russians are so interested in education for a reason, not in healthcare. They don't pay that much attention to healthcare. Also, public government, they don't really care about that. Utilities, they don't really care about it. But educators, schools, well, of course, it's very cyclical. It comes in cycles. There's an active phase, then it goes down, but this is pretty systematic. They even were picking people from different regions of Ukraine who would relocate, move to the occupied territories, and do what the occupational authorities tell them to. So, I set a goal for myself to gather this information and to somehow try in our present-day context, in the 21st century, in a peaceful Europe, explain how did it happen so that we have a huge war between two states, and the aggressor state is using educators to implement their occupational tasks. You know, I'm somehow trying to do that. Well, now regarding the sources, as my colleague mentioned previously, there are lots of sources that basically are people that you talk to. Some people agree to be interviewed. Others are simply telling you, and you're trying to take notes to not forget and omit some important thoughts. And then, of course, you have to put it on paper, but you have to keep in mind the security and safety aspects as well as moral aspects, because it's very difficult for people. Let me give you a simple example for you to understand how tragic it is. A school principal, her children's godmother, a very, very close person, basically, secretly, from the school principal, agreed to become the principal of the school where her friend used to work under the occupational administration. And the school principal herself learned about that when this Hauptleiter came, the one that was appointed by the Russian authorities, like the mayor basically in the occupied territories, and said that this is the new school principal. Can you imagine that? This person couldn't wrap herself around it. This is basically like a family member. You know, we say that this person is so close to me that I could even sleep with them in the same bed. That was like a very close friend to her, and she didn't tell her anything and took her job. And this kind of things happen. And this happens even inside families. Well, this is complicated, but it's very interesting subject for research. I hope I managed to answer your questions. Yes, thank you so much, Mykhailo. Valery Tomazov, over to you. Good afternoon, Mykhailo. Thank you so much for your presentation. And up to your very final question, I kept thinking about one question. Was the situation different in Kherson, for example, and in Kiev Oblast, in terms of the attitude towards teachers? Because I would like to also say something to stand up for the history and Ukrainian language teachers. In Kiev Oblast, the situation was different. Here, the lists were made up of the teachers of history and Ukrainian language, and they were included into the same list as ATO, anti-terroristic operational access, as well as political activists, etc. And many of them were affected. One very professional, one very good, reliable source also told me that the list of scholars were made, historians and philologists of the National Academy of Sciences. And these people are mentioned and the ones who cannot be changed in terms of their views. So situation in different regions, I think, varied. In different communities even, not only regions, but also communities. And I think many people who showed their active Ukrainian position are the ones who also showed their Komsomol position very actively 40 years ago. And maybe their communist position also 60 years ago. You know, this is a peculiar category of people who are always trying to get into a certain group of people that are needed by authorities, any authorities. So they're ready to collaborate with any kind of authority that is in place. That is why I wanted to ask a question, whether the attitude was different in Kherson to different teachers of different subjects. And the final phrase, and that's the situation is such, but in Kiev Oblast, it was different. And I would like to also say that in the National History Museum of the World War II, there is a huge amount of materials from Kherson Oblast. And there was an exhibition and the school bags that were prepared by the occupation authorities were exhibited there. So all of it was there, but they didn't use that because the school year did not start because principals and teachers refused to collaborate. That is why, yes. And Probably there were not that many who were ready to collaborate, so thank you and all the best. Valeria, I would like to once again emphasize the situation with collaborationism does not only vary depending on the region, it even varies in communities and even varies from school to school. This
надзвичайно нестандартною для людей, що
is such an out-of-the-box situation that actions of every person are so interesting from the viewpoint of researching them. And I think that multiple generations of Ukrainian scholars will try analyzing and somehow generalizing their behavior. Because you see here, it is at the intersection of psychology, politology, history, you know, this phenomenon. It's mind-blowing when you're reading about all of that and you're trying to somehow generalize it all. Thank you so much. All the best. Thank you, colleagues. I'd like to remind you that we have only 4 minutes until the end of discussing this lecture, this presentation. I'd like to remind you that we also have a Telegram channel. So please, in case we cannot give the floor to all those who want to ask questions, please use our Telegram channel to submit your question for Mykhailo in our Telegram channel. Now, Maria Rohoja, over to you.
Доброго дня. Дуже цікава доповідь.
Good afternoon. Very interesting presentation and such serious generalizations because it's been almost 18 months, but still, this kind of generalizations are a pretty big thing. And I have only one comment because we are very short on time. Well, even a question rather than a comment. How do you think? Why does the number of information coming from the occupied territories is shrinking? Because you said that there is less information. Yeah, okay. Let me try to answer to that. Because the amount of information is shrinking because first and foremost, Russian special services are trying to get rid of those who will convey this information. And secondly, Russia is now closing everything from the rest of the world, and the occupied territories are not an exception. We see this information policy at the federal level, and it also goes down to the local level. The information has been filtered. Well, you see, even the faces of the collaborators are not shown openly. That is why it is quite problematic to obtain information. And also, what kind of information do we want to know? Because this is also a problem. There is a lot of information, but which one we need specifically? Because Ukrainian special services share one set of information, but we as this scholars need a different set of information. Thank you. Maybe we can take one more question. Oleg, over to you.
Доброго дня. Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Mykhailo, thank you so much for an interesting presentation, but we're short on time. One quick question. Can we look at collaborationism and forced collaboration to save your life? Can we compare this to say there's 5% of collaborators and I get your question. I can already answer so that we do not lose any time. Yes, you can compare them, but only people and a court can do this kind of comparison. The reason is very simple. Forced collaborationism does exist. People are being forced. But what I mentioned in the beginning, this forced collaborationism damaged Ukrainian people safety and our victory. And the court is to make a decision because yes, a person has been imprisoned, the person has undergone violence, but the result, they damaged so much, then sometimes I'm sorry for being so open. It's only the court who can make this kind of ruling. And yeah, did that happen? And you have to also be very, very careful when dealing with that. Yes, but based on your presentation, there were people who wanted to to see some career advancement, etc. And during the occupation, well, I'm only talking about those who did it voluntarily, because yes, there are people who are not even hiding it. They say that they voluntarily signed up to that, but the forced one, well, this is a very peculiar, very specific topic, and you have to be very, very careful with that to do no harm. Thank you so much. To do no harm to a person, because we do not know what caused them to do that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. And I would like to especially ask our presenter for such an amazingly interesting, relevant, and worrying presentation. But Mykhailo's words about the fact that everything is not as bad do give us some hope. Thank you so much. Everything will be good. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.
Я перепрошую.